Have you seen the Times this morning, Mr. Schuster?
I can't afford the Times. I take the Telegraph.
Well, it may be in that too. In the deaths. Miss Elizabeth Temple, DSC.
I do not think I am familiar with the name.
Headmistress of Fallowfield. You've heard of Fallowfield, haven't you?
Ah, yes, of course. Girls' school. It's been going for 50 years or so. First class. Fantastically expensive. So she was the headmistress, was she? I thought the headmistress resigned some time ago. 6 months at least. I'm sure I read about it in the paper. That is to say, there was a bit about the new headmistress. Married woman, youngish, 35 to 40. Modern ideas. Give the girls lessons in cosmetics and let 'em wear trouser suits, something of that kind.
I don't quite think she is going to make the name that Elizabeth Temple did. Quite someone she was. Been there a long time, too.
Yes.
Mr. Schuster was somewhat uninterested. He wondered why Broadrib was so interested in defunct school headmistresses. Schools were not really a particular interest to either of the two gentlemen. Their own offspring were now more or less disposed of. Mr. Broadrib's 2 sons were respectively in the civil service and in an oil firm, and Mr. Schuster's rather younger progeny were at different universities, where both of them, respectively, were making as much trouble for those in authority as they possibly could do.
What about her?
She was on the coach tour.
Oh, those coaches. I wouldn't let any of my relations go on one of those. One went off a precipice in Switzerland last week, and 2 months ago one had a crash and 20 were killed. Don't know who drives these things nowadays.
It was one of those country houses and gardens and objects of interest in Britain, or whatever they call it, tours.
Oh, yes, the one we sent Miss What's-her-name on, the one old Raphael booked.
Miss Jane Marple, yes, she was on it, the same one.
She didn't get killed too, did she?
No, not so far as I know. I just wondered a bit, though.
Was it a road accident?
No. It was at one of the beauty spot places. They were walking up a path to a hill. It was a stiff walk, up a rather steep hill with boulders and things on it. Some of the boulders got loose and came rushing down the mountainside. Miss Temple was knocked out and taken to hospital with concussion and died.
It's bad luck.
And I only wondered, because I happened to remember that, well, Fallowfield was the school where the girl was at.
What girl? I don't really know what you're talking about, Mr. Broadrib.
The girl who was done in by young Michael Raphael. I was just recalling a few things which might seem to have some slight connection with this curious Jane Marple business that old Raphael was so keen on. I wish he'd told us more.
What is the connection?
He looked interested now. His legal wits were in process of being sharpened to give a sound opinion on whatever it was that Mr. Broadrib was about to confide to him. That girl, I can't remember her last name now, but her Christian name was Hope, or Faith, or something like that. Verity, that was her name. Verity Hunter, I think it was. She was one of that series of murdered girls. They found her body in a ditch about 30 miles away from where she'd gone missing, and she'd been dead 6 months, strangled apparently, and her head and face had been bashed in, to delay recognition, they thought. But she was recognized. Clothes, handbag, jewellery nearby, some mole or scar. Oh, yes, she was identified quite easily.
Actually, she was the one the trial was all about, wasn't she?
Yes. Michael was suspected of perhaps murdering 3 other girls during the past year, but the police did not have such good evidence for those, so they went all out on this one. Plenty of evidence. And his bad record. Earlier cases of assault and rape. Well, we all know what rape is nowadays. Mum tells the girl she's got to accuse the young man of rape, even if the young man hasn't had much chance, with the girl at him all the time to come to the house while Mum's away at work or Dad's gone on holiday. doesn't stop badgering him until she's forced him to sleep with her. Then, as I say, Mum tells the girl to call it rape. However, that's not the point. I wondered if things mightn't tie up a bit, you know. I thought this Jane Marple business with Raphael might have something to do with Michael.
Well, he was found guilty, wasn't he? Given a life sentence.
Yes, I think so. It's such a long time ago. Or did they get away with a verdict of diminished responsibility?
And Verity Hunter or Hunt was educated at that school, Miss Temple's school, She wasn't still a schoolgirl, though, at the time, when she was killed, not that I can remember.
No, she was 18 or 19, living with relations or friends of her parents or something. Nice house, nice people, nice girl by all accounts. The sort of girl whose relations always say she was a very quiet girl, rather shy, didn't go about with strange people, didn't have any boyfriends. Relations never know what boyfriends a girl has. The girls take mighty good care of that. And young Raphael was said to be very attractive to girls.
Well, there's never been any doubt that he did it.
No, not a scrap. Told a lot of lies in the witness box anyway, and his counsel would have done better not to have let him give evidence. A lot of his friends gave him an alibi, but that didn't stand up. All his friends seemed to be fluent liars.
What's your feeling about it, Broadrape?
I haven't got any feelings. I was just wondering if this woman's death might tie up.
But in what way?
Well, you know, about these boulders that fall down cliff sides and drop on top of someone. It's not always in the course of nature. Boulders usually stay where they are, in my experience. Verity. Elizabeth Margaret Temple had died the evening before. It had been a peaceful death. Miss Marple, sitting once more amidst the faded chintz of the drawing-room in the old manor house, had laid aside the baby's pink coat which she had previously been engaged in knitting, and had substituted a crocheted purple scarf. This half-mourning touch went with Miss Marple's early Victorian ideas of tactfulness in face of tragedy. The inquest was to be held on the following day. The vicar had been approached and had agreed to hold a brief memorial service in the church as soon as arrangements could be made. Undertakers, suitably attired with proper mourning faces, took general charge of things in liaison with the police. The inquest was to take place on the following morning at 11 o'clock. Members of the coach tour had agreed to attend the inquest, and several of them had chosen to remain on so as to attend the church service also. Mrs. Glynn had come to the Golden Boar and urged Miss Marple to return to the old manor house until she finally returned to the tour.
"You'll get away from all the reporters."
Miss Marple thanked all three sisters warmly and accepted. The coach tour would be resumed after the memorial service, driving first to South Bedstone, 35 miles away, where there was a good-class hotel which had been originally chosen for a stopping place, and that the tour would go on as usual. There were, however, as Miss Marple had considered likely, certain persons who were disengaging themselves and returning home, or were going in other directions and not continuing on the tour. There was something to be said in favour of either decision. To leave what would become a journey of painful memories, or to continue with the sightseeing that had already been paid for and which had been interrupted only by one of those painful accidents that may happen on any sightseeing expedition. A lot would depend, Miss Marple thought, on the outcome of the inquest. Miss Marple, after exchanging various conventional remarks proper to the occasion with her three hostesses, had devoted herself to her purple wool and had sat considering her next line of investigation. And so it was that, with her fingers still busy, she had uttered the one word, verity, throwing it in as one throws a pebble into a stream, solely to observe what the result, if any, would be. Would it mean something to her hostesses? It might or it might not. Otherwise, when she joined the members of the tour at their hotel meal this evening, which had been arranged, she would try the effect of it there. It had been, she thought to herself, the last word, or almost the last word, that Elizabeth Temple had spoken. So therefore, thought Miss Marple, her fingers still busy because she did not need to look at her crocheting, she could read a book or conduct a conversation, while her fingers, though slightly crippled with rheumatism, would proceed correctly through their appointed movements. So, therefore,
Verity.
Like a stone into a pool, causing ripples, a splash, something, or nothing. Surely there would be a reaction of one sort or another? Yes, she had not been mistaken. Although her face registered nothing, the keen eyes between her glasses had watched 3 people in a simultaneous manner, as she had trained herself to do for many years now, when wishing to observe her neighbours, either in church mothers' meetings or at other public functions in St. Mary Mead, when she had been on the track of some interesting piece of news or gossip. Mrs. Glynn had dropped the book she was holding and had looked across towards Miss Marple with slight surprise, but not surprised really to hear it. Clotilde reacted differently. Her head shot up. She leant forward a little. Then she looked not at Miss Marple, but across the room in the direction of the window. Her hands clenched themselves. She kept very still. Miss Marple, although dropping her head slightly as though she was not looking any more, noted that her eyes were filling with tears. Clotilde sat quite still and let the tears roll down her cheeks. She made no attempt to take out a handkerchief. She uttered no word. Miss Marple was impressed by the aura of grief that came from her. Anthea's reaction was different. It was quick, excited, almost pleasurable.
Verity, did you say? Did you know her? I'd no idea. It is Verity Hunt, you mean? It's a Christian name, then? Oh, I never knew anyone of that name. But I did mean a Christian name, yes. It's rather unusual, I think. Verity.
She let her purple wool ball fall and looked round with the slightly apologetic and embarrassed look of one who realizes she's made a serious faux pas, but not sure why.
I'm so sorry. Have I said something I shouldn't? It was only because— Oh, no, of course not, said Mrs. Glynn. It was just that it's a name we know, a name with which we've associations. It just came into my mind, because, you know, it was poor Miss Temple who said it. I went to see her, you know, yesterday afternoon. Professor Wanstead took me. He seemed to think that I might be able to— I don't know if it's the proper word— to rouse her in some way. She was in a coma, and they thought— not that I was a friend of hers at any time, but we had chatted together on the tour, and we often sat beside each other, as you know, and on some of the days we had talked. He thought perhaps I might be of some use. I'm afraid I wasn't, though, not at all. I just sat there and waited, and then she did say 1 or 2 words, but they did not seem to mean anything. But finally, just when it was time for me to go, she opened her eyes and looked at me. I don't know if she was mistaking me for someone, but she did say that word, Verity. Well, of course it stuck in my mind, especially with her passing away yesterday evening. It must have been someone or something that she had in her mind. But of course it might just mean, well, truth. I mean, that's what Verity means, isn't it? She looked from Clotilde to Lavinia to Anthea. It was the Christian name of a girl we knew. That is why it startled us. Especially because of the awful way she died.
Anthea, Clotilde said in her deeper voice, there's no need to go into details.
But everyone knows quite well about her,
said Anthea. She looked towards Miss Marple.
I thought perhaps you might have known about her, because you knew Mr. Raphael, didn't you? Well, I mean, he wrote to us about you, so you must have known him. I thought perhaps he'd mentioned the whole thing to you. I'm so sorry. I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you mean. They found her body in a ditch.
There was never any holding Anthea, Miss Marple thought, not once she got going. But she thought that Anthea's vociferous talk was putting additional strain on Clotilde. She had taken out her handkerchief now in a quiet, non-committal way, and brushed tears from her eyes. She then sat upright, her back very straight, and her eyes deep and tragic. Verity was a girl we cared for very much. She lived here for a while. I was very fond of her.
Oh, and she was very fond of you.
Her parents were friends of mine. They were killed in a plane accident.
She was at school at Fallowfield, explained Lavinia. I suppose that's how Miss Temple came to remember her. Oh, I see. That's where Miss Temple was headmistress, wasn't it? I have heard of Fallowfield often, of course. It's a very fine school, isn't it?
Yes, Verity was a pupil there. After her parents died, she came to stay with us for a time, while she could decide what she wanted to do with her future. She was 18 or 19, a very sweet girl, and a very affectionate and loving one. She thought perhaps of training for nursing, but she'd very good brains, and Miss Temple was very insistent that she ought to go to university. So she was studying and having coaching for that, when this terrible thing happened. Do you mind if we do not talk about it any more just now?
Oh, of course not. I'm so sorry to have impinged on some tragedy. I didn't know. I hadn't heard. I thought, oh dear.
That evening she heard a little more. Mrs. Glynn came to her bedroom when she was changing her dress to go out and join the others at the hotel.
I thought I ought to come and explain a little to you about the girl, Verity Hunt. Of course you couldn't possibly know our sister Clotilde was particularly fond of her. The really horrible death was a terrible shock. We never mention her if we can help it, but, I think it would be easier if I told you the facts completely, so you will understand. Apparently, Verity, without our knowledge, had made friends with an undesirable, more than undesirable it turned out to be, a very dangerous young man who had already got a criminal record. He came here to visit us when he was passing through once. We knew his father very well, and I think I'd better tell you the whole truth. You don't seem to know it. He was actually Mr. Raphael's son, Michael.
Oh, dear!
Well, I couldn't remember the name, but I do remember hearing that there was a son, and that he was not very satisfactory. A little more than that. He'd always given trouble. He'd been had up in court once or twice for various things, assaulting a teenager and other things of that type. Of course, I consider myself that the magistrates are too lenient with that kind of thing. They don't want to upset a young man's university career, so they let him off with whatever they call it, suspended sentence. If these boys were sent to jail at once, it would perhaps warn them off that type of life. He was a thief, too. He'd forged cheques. He'd pinched things. He was a thoroughly bad lot. We were friends of his mother's, you see. It was lucky for her, I think, that she died young before she had time to be upset by the way her son was turning out. Mr. Raphael did all he could, I think. Tried to find him suitable jobs, paid fines for him and things like that. He pretended to be more or less indifferent and write it off as one of those things would happen. We had, as probably people here in the village will tell you, we had a bad outbreak of murders and violence in this district. Oh, not only here, they were in different parts of the country, 20 miles away, sometimes 50. One or two, it's suspected by the police, were nearly 100 miles away, but all by the same person, and they seemed to centre more or less on this part of the world. Anyway, Verity went out one day to visit a friend and didn't come back. We went to the police, and the police sought for her, searched the whole countryside. They couldn't find any trace. We advertised, they advertised. They suggested she may have gone off with a boyfriend. Then word began to get around that she'd been seen with Michael Raphael, and by now the police had their eye on Michael as a possibility for certain crimes that had occurred. They couldn't find any direct evidence, though. Verity was said to have been seen, described by her clothing and other things, with a young man of Michael's appearance, and in a car that corresponded to a description of his car. There was no further evidence, until her body was discovered 6 months later, 30 miles from here, in a rather wild part of the woodland, in a ditch covered with stones and piled earth. Clotilde had to go and identify it. It was Verity, all right. She'd been strangled, and her head beaten in. Clotilde's never quite got over the shock. There were certain marks, a mole, an old scar, and of course her clothes and the contents of her bag. Miss Temple was very fond of Verity. She must have thought of her just before she died. I am sorry. I'm really very, very sorry. Please tell your sister that I didn't know. I had no idea. I walked slowly along the village street, on the way towards the marketplace, where the inquest is to take place, in an old-fashioned Georgian building which has been known for 100 years as the Curfew Arms. There was still a good 20 minutes to go before I need to be there, so I decided to look in at the wool shop. It sold babies' jackets too, and a girl in the shop was serving small woolly coats which were being tried on by 2 children. I looked about. Further down the counter was an elderly woman. "Oh, good morning. I wonder if you can help me. I've run out of this particular colour of wool. Are you able to match it?" "I'm sure we can match it, madam. Let me have a look. Yes, here we are." I discovered that her name was Mrs. Merripit, the very name that was written up outside of the shop. I mentioned that I was on my way to the inquest, and she was full of the importance of the accident, and the general difficulties of getting local governments to do anything about the dangers of footpaths and public rights-of-way. After the rain, you see, you get all the soil washed off, and then the boulders get loose, and then down they comes. I remember one year they had 3 falls, 3 accidents there was. One boy nearly killed, he was. And then later that year, 6 months later, I think, there was a man got his arm broken. And the 3rd time it was poor old Mrs. Walker. Blind she was, pretty deaf too, so she never heard anything. And she couldn't have got out of the way if she had. She wasn't very mobile, you see, so she was killed. Oh, how sad, how tragic. That sort of thing is not easily forgotten, is it? No, indeed. I expect the coroner will mention it today. I expect he will. In a terrible way, it seems quite a natural thing to happen, doesn't it? Though, of course, there are accidents sometimes by pushing things about. Just pushing, making stones rock, that sort of thing. Ah, well, there's boys as'll be up to anything, but I don't think I've ever seen them up that way, fooling about. Oh, now I must ask you about pullovers. I'm knitting one for one of my great-nephews, you see, and he wants bright colours, for a polo neck. Oh, yes, they do like bright colours nowadays, don't they? Not jeans, though, black jeans they like, black or dark blue, but they like a bit of brightness up above. I described a pullover of check design in bright colours. There appeared to be quite a good stock of pullovers and jerseys, but nothing in red and black. Nor had there been anything in red and black lately in stock. I looked at a few samples and prepared to make my departure. I mentioned the former murders I'd heard about. Oh, yes, they got that fellow in the end. Nice-looking boy. Hardly have thought it of him. He'd been very well brought up, you know. Been to university and all that. Father very rich, they say. Touched in the head, I suppose. Not that they sent him to Broadway, or wherever the place is. No, they didn't do that, but I think myself he must have been a mental case. There was 5 or 6 other girls, so they said. The police had one after another of the young men round hereabouts to help them. Geoffrey Grant they had up. They were pretty sure it was him to begin with. He was always a bit queer, ever since he was a boy. Interfered with little girls going to school, you know. He used to offer them sweets and get them to come down the lane and see the primroses. Or something like that. Yes, they had very strong suspicions about him. But it wasn't him. And then there was another one, Bert Williams. But he'd been away on 2 of the occasions at least, so he had what they call an alibi, so it wasn't him. And then at last it came to this, well, whatever his name was. Oh, I can't remember now. Was it Luke? No. Mike? Oh, very nice-looking anyway, as I say. But he had a bad record, yes. Stealing, forging cheques, all that sort of thing. And 2, what do you call them? Not paternity cases, I don't mean that. Oh, you know what I mean. When a girl's going to have a baby, and they make an order to make the fellow pay. Well, he'd got 2 girls in the family way before this. Was this girl in the family way?
Oh, yes, she was.
At first we thought when the body was found it might be Nora Broad. That was Mrs. Broad's niece, down at the mill shop. Great one for going out to the boys, she was. She'd gone away missing from home in the same way. Nobody knew where she was. So when this body turned up 6 months later, they thought at first it was her. But it wasn't. No, someone quite different. Did her body ever turn up? No. I suppose it might some day. But they think on the whole it was pushed into the river. But you never know, do you? You'll never know what you might dig up in a ploughed field, or something like that. Do you know, I was taken once to see all that treasure at Luton Loo, somewhere in the East Counties. That was under a ploughed field. Oh, it was beautiful. Gold ships and Viking ships and gold plate. Enormous great platters. So you never know, do you? Any day you may turn up a dead body, or you may turn up a gold platter. It may be hundreds of years old, like that gold plate was, or 3 or 4 years old, like Mary Lucas, who'd been missing for 4 years, they say. She was found somewhere near Reigate. Oh, of all these things. It's a sad life. Yes, it's a very sad life. You never know what's coming. There was another girl who lived here, wasn't there, who was killed? Oh, you mean the body they thought was Norma Broad's? Oh, yes. Well, I've forgotten her name now. I think it was Hope, or Charity, one of those sort of names, if you know what I mean. It used to be used a lot in Victorian times, but you don't hear them so much now. She lived at the Manor House. She'd been there for some time after her parents were killed. Yes, I heard something about that. Didn't they die in an accident? Yes, in a plane going to Spain, or Italy, one of those places. And you say she came to live here? Were they relations of hers? I don't know if they were relations, but Mrs. Glynn, as she is now, was a great friend, I think, of her mother's, or something like that. Mrs. Glynn, of course, was married and gone abroad, but Miss Clotilde, she's the eldest one, the dark one, she was very fond of the girl, and she took her abroad to Italy and France, all sorts of places. And she had her trained a bit of typewriting and shorthand and that sort of thing, and art classes too. She's very arty, Miss Clotilde. She was mighty fond of the girl, broken-hearted when she disappeared. Quite different to Miss Anthea. Oh, the youngest one, isn't she? Yes, not quite all there, some people say. Scatty, you know, in her mind. Sometimes you see her walking along, talking to herself, tossing her head in a very queer way. Children get frightened of her sometimes. They say she's a bit queer about things. Oh, I don't know. You hear everything in a village, don't you? The great-uncle who lived here before, he was a bit peculiar too. Used to practice revolver shooting in the garden, for no reason at all as far as I could see. Proud of his marksmanship, he said he was, whatever marksmanship is. But Miss Clotilde is not peculiar. Oh, no, she is clever, she is. Knows Latin and Greek, I believe. Would have liked to go to university, but she had to look after her mother, who was an invalid, for a long time. But she was very fond of Miss... Oh, what was her name? Perhaps it was Faith. Anyway, she was very fond of her and treated her like a daughter. And then along comes this young what's-his-name, Michael, I think it was. And then one day the girl just goes off without saying a word to anyone. I don't know if Miss Clotilde knew as she was in the family way, though. But you knew? Well, I've got a lot of experience. I usually know when a girl's that way. It's plain enough to the eye. It's not only the shape. You can tell by the look in their eyes, the way they walk and sit, the sort of giddy fits they get and sick turns now and again. Oh, yes, I thought to myself, here's another of them. Miss Clotilde had to go and identify the body. It nearly broke her up, it did. She was like a different woman for weeks afterwards. Fairly loved that girl, she did. And Miss Anthea? Funnily enough, you know, I thought
she had a kind of pleased look, as though she was, yes, just pleased. It's not nice, is it? Farmer Plummer's daughter used to look like that. Always liked to go and see the pigs killed. Enjoyed it, she did. There's funny things goes on in families. I said good-bye. There was still another 10 minutes to pass. I decided to go into the post office. The post office and general store of Jocelyn St. Mary is just off the market square. I went inside and bought some stamps and looked at some of the postcards before turning my attention to various paperback books. A middle-aged woman with a rather vinegary face presided behind the counter. She helped me get a book free from the wire support. Yes, they do stick a bit sometimes, don't they? People don't put them in straight, you see. There we are. There was by now no one else in the shop. I looked at the jacket of the book. It was a naked girl with blood-stained markings on her face, and a sinister-looking killer bending over her with a blood-stained knife in his hand. Really, I don't like these horrors nowadays. They've gone a bit too far, haven't they, with some of their jackets? Not everyone likes them. Too fond of violence in every way, I'd say, nowadays. I detached a second book. Oh, whatever happened to baby Jane? Oh, dear. It's a sad world one lives in. Oh, I know. I saw in yesterday's paper some woman left her baby outside a supermarket, and then someone else came along and wheeled it away. All for no reason, as far as I can see. The police found her, but they all seem to say the same things, whether they steal from a supermarket or take a baby. Don't know what came over me, they say. Perhaps they really don't. It'll take me a lot to believe that. I looked around the post office. It was still empty. I went to the window to pay. I wondered if you're not too busy, if you could answer a question of mine. You see, I've done something rather stupid. Of late years I tend to make so many mistakes. But I had a parcel addressed to a charity. I sent them clothes, you see, pullovers and children's woolies. I did it up and addressed it and sent it off, when only this morning it came to me suddenly that I'd made a mistake. I'd written the wrong address. I don't suppose you keep a list of the addresses of parcels, but I thought someone might have just happened to remember it. The address I meant to put was the Dockyard and Thames Side Welfare Association. The vinegary lady looked at me quite kindly now, touched perhaps by my patent incapacity and general state of senility and dither. Did you bring it in yourself? Oh, no, I didn't. You see, I'm staying at the old manor house, and one of the... Mrs. Glynn, I think. Or was it her sister? One of them said they would post it for me. It was very kind of her. Let me see now. It would have been on Tuesday, would it? It wasn't Mrs. Glynn who brought it in. It was the youngest one, Miss Anthea. Oh, yes, I think that was the day. I remember it quite well. A good-sized dress box, moderately heavy, I think. But not what you said, Dockyard Association. No, I can't recall anything like that. I think it was the Reverend Matthews, the East Ham Women and Children's Woolen Clothing Appeal. Oh, yes. Oh, how clever of you! I see now how I came to do it. At Christmas I do send things to the East Ham Society in answer to a special appeal for knitted things. I must have copied down the wrong address. Oh, now can you repeat it? I already had my notebook in my hand. Mrs. Vinegar complied. I'm afraid it's gone off, though. Oh, yes, but I can write, explaining my mistake, and ask them to forward it to the Dockyard Association instead. Thank you so much. I just heard her say to a customer who came in as I left, "Scatty as they make them, poor old creature. I expect she's always doing that sort of thing." As I left the post office, I ran straight into Emlyn Price and Joanna Crawford. I noticed Joanna was rather pale and looked upset. "I've got to give evidence. I don't know what they think they can ask me. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I told the police sergeant. I told him what I thought we saw." "Don't you worry, Joanna. This is just a coroner's inquest, you know. He's a nice man, a doctor. He'll just ask you a few questions, and you just say what you saw. You saw it too? Yes, I did. At least I saw someone up there, near the boulders. Now, come on, Joanna. They came and searched our rooms in the hotel, Miss Marple. They asked our permission, but they had a search warrant. They looked in our rooms and among the things in our luggage. What did they think they were going to find? I think perhaps they wanted to find that check pullover you described. Anyway, there's nothing for you to worry about. If you had a black and scarlet pullover yourself, you wouldn't have talked about it, would you? It was black and scarlet, wasn't it?
I don't know. I don't really know the colours of things very well. I think it was a sort of bright colour. That's all I know.
They didn't find one. Of course they didn't find one. None of us have very many things with us anyway. Well, you don't when you go on a coach tour. There wasn't anything like that among anybody's things. And I've never seen anyone of our lot wearing anything like that. Well, not so far. Have you?
No, I haven't, but I don't suppose I'd know if I had seen it. I don't always seem to know red from green.
No, you are a bit colour-blind, aren't you? I noticed that the other day.
What do you mean you noticed it?
My red scarf. I asked if you'd seen it. You said you hadn't, but you'd seen a green one somewhere, and you brought me the red one. I'd left it in the dining room, but you didn't really know it was red.
Well, don't go about saying I'm colour-blind. I don't like it. Puts people off, in some way.
Men are more often colour-blind than women. It's one of these sex-link things. It passes through the female and comes out in the male.
You make it sound like it was the measles. Well, here we are.
You don't seem to mind about giving evidence.
I don't, really. I've never been to an inquest. Things are rather interesting when you do them for the first time. Dr. Stokes was a middle-aged man with greying hair and spectacles. Police evidence was given first, then the medical evidence with technical details of the concussion injuries which had caused death. Mrs. Sandbourne gave particulars of the coach tour, the expeditions arranged for that particular afternoon, and particulars of how the fatality had occurred. Miss Temple, she said, although not young, was a very brisk walker. The party were going along a well-known footpath which led round the curve of a hill, which slowly mounted to the old moorland church originally built in Elizabethan times, though repaired and added to later. On an adjoining crest was what she called the Bonaventure Memorial. It was a fairly steep ascent, and people usually climbed it at different paces from each other. The younger ones very often ran or walked ahead and reached their destination much earlier than the others. The elderly ones took it slowly. She herself usually kept at the rear of a party, so that she could, if necessary, suggest to people who were tired that they could, if they liked, go back. Miss Temple, she said, had been talking to a Mr. and Mrs. Butler. Miss Temple, though she was over 60, had been slightly impatient at their slow pace, and had outdistanced them, and then had turned a corner and gone on ahead rather rapidly, which she had done often before. She was inclined to get impatient if waiting for people to catch up for too long, and preferred to make her own pace. They had heard a cry ahead, and she and the others had run on, turned a curve of a pathway, and had found Miss Temple lying on the ground. A large boulder detached from the hillside above, where there were several others of the same kind, must, they had thought, rolled down from the hillside and struck Miss Temple as she was going along the path below. A most unfortunate and tragic accident. You had no idea there was anything but an accident?
No, indeed. I can hardly see how it could have been anything but an accident.
You saw no one above you on the hillside?
No. This is the main path round the hill, but of course people do wander about on the top. But I didn't see anyone that particular afternoon.
Then Joanna Crawford was called. After particulars of her name and age, Dr. Stokes asked, You were not walking with the remainder of the party?
No, we'd left the path. We'd gone round the hill a little higher up the slope.
You were walking with a companion?
Yes, Mr. Emlyn Price.
There was no one else actually walking with you?
No, we were talking, looking at one or two of the flowers. They seemed a rather uncommon kind. Emlyn is interested in botany.
Were you out of sight of the rest of the party?
Not at the time. They were walking along the main path, some way below us.
Did you see Miss Temple?
I think so. She was walking ahead of the others, and I think I saw her turn a corner of the path ahead of them, after which we didn't see her. because the contour of the hill hid her.
Did you see someone walking above you on the hillside?
Yes, up amongst a good many boulders. There is a sort of great patch of boulders on the side of a hill.
Yes, I know the place you mean. Large granite boulders. People call them the Weathers, or the Grey Weathers sometimes.
I suppose they might look like sheep from a distance, but we weren't so very far away from them.
And you saw someone up there?
Yes. Someone was more or less in the middle of the boulders, leaning over them.
Pushing them, do you think?
Yes, I did think so, wondered why. He seemed to be pushing at one on the outside of a group near the edge. They were so big and heavy, I would have thought it was impossible to push them. But the one he, or she, was pushing seemed to be balanced like a rocking stone.
You say first he, now you say he or she. Which do you think it was, Miss Crawford?
Well, I suppose I thought it was a man, but I wasn't really thinking at the time. It was he or she was wearing trousers and a pullover, a sort of man's pullover with a polo neck.
What colour was the pullover?
Rather a bright red and black in checks. And there was longish hair at the back of a kind of beret, rather like a woman's hair, but it might just have been a man's.
It certainly might. Identifying a male or female figure by their hair is certainly not easy these days. What happened next?
Well, the stone began to roll over. It sort of toppled over the edge, and then it began to gain speed. I said to Emmeline, "It's going to run down the hill." Then we heard a sort of crash as it fell. I think I heard a cry from below, but I might have imagined it.
And then?
We ran on up a bit, round the corner of the hill, to see what had happened to the stone.
And what did you see?
Boulder below on the path, with a body underneath it, and people coming running round the corner.
Was it Miss Temple who uttered the cry?
I think it must have been. It might have been one of the others who was catching up and turned the corner, but it was really horrible.
Yes, I'm sure it was. What happened to the figure you saw above? The man or woman in the red and black pullover? Was that figure still there among the stones?
I don't know. I never looked up there. I was too busy looking at the accident and running down the hill to see if we could do anything. I did just look up, I think, but there wasn't anyone in sight. Only the stones. There were a lot of contours, and you could lose anyone quite easily from view.
Could it have been one of your party?
No, I'm sure it wasn't one of us. I mean, I'd have known by their clothes. I'm sure nobody was wearing a scarlet and black pullover.
I see. Thank you, Miss Crawford.
Emmeline Price was called next. His story was practically a replica of Joanna's. There was a little more evidence, which did not amount to much.
I conclude that there is not sufficient evidence at this point to show how Miss Elizabeth Temple came to her death. For that reason, this inquest is adjourned for a fortnight.